I have to start by, sure, here, or should I sit there?
If you'd like to sit.
I'm fine like this. So I can see everybody. And so I'm very happy to be here. And I would like to thank the Trust, Barry Emil and Norman Melbourne Trust. I was happy to, I was moved to hear the few words you said about them. Their contribution to the complex histories of socialism, the need for a thorough critique of the existing social order, and the conviction that to change that order, we definitely need to try and understand it first, the way it operates, its foundations, which requires massive investment in reawakening critical faculties, which is understood to be an important aspect of the work done at this Institute for the Humanities here and in other parts of the world. I'm also happy to be here because of the friends and teachers who have been here since yesterday. My very dear Paul and Vron came all the way from Devon to be here, and I was very happy to spend a few hours with them. Jacqueline is here, Esther, and many other friends. So I feel protected. You mentioned the prizes in Germany. I don't feel protected in Germany, but I feel protected here. So what I will do is that I will just try to share with you a set of intuitions. I'm not going to give any systematic lecture. I will share with you a set of intuitions, most of which are not just, most of which are shared by a number of people I've been working with, mostly in West and Central Africa over the last few years. I would say the last 2 or 3 years. So over the last 2 and 3 years, I've spent a huge amount of time, although based in Johannesburg, working with activists, working with artists, academics, intellectuals, youth and women's organizations, trying to set up a platform called the Innovation Foundation for Democracy. The platform is dedicated to relaunching the democratic agenda in Africa in particular. You will have noticed the paradox, which consists in attempting to relaunch a democratic agenda at a time when almost all over the world we are witnessing the erosion of democratic values, or witnessing the, as Wendy Brown puts it, the hollowing out of democracy, including in the African continent itself. It happens that, as Paul Gilroy has shown long ago, that Africa and the African diasporic world are far from being strangers in the long and short history of democracy and freedom in the modern world. I don't need to mention here the key event the Haitian Revolution did represent. I mentioned the Haitian Revolution. I could mention many other slaves' revolutions, some of which maybe didn't succeed, some of which have disappeared from our history books, although they remain firmly embedded in the deep memories of those times. I could also mention the anti-colonial struggles which began, as far as Africa is concerned, during the 19th century, reached a pitch, especially in the aftermath of the Second World War, and were punctuated by a whole variety of engagements, for instance, for the abolition of forced labor in former French colonies, the abolition of native codes, just as there existed slave codes. There were native codes, the Code de l'Indigène, which codes which, in fact, were writing into the law itself and sanctifying into the law the racial discrimination and various forms of inequality. Or the whole struggle against apartheid, various struggles for citizenship rights, including, of course, basic rights to existence, but also substantive rights having to do with the betterment of the material conditions of existence, food, shelter, education, the right to mobility, the right to security and protection, and above all, the right to a future of dignity, as evidenced, for instance, in the South African Freedom Charter, which begins with a very famous article, "South Africa belongs to all who live in it." The obligation to share the same world we all inherit of. It also happens that in Africa, this long history was somewhat interrupted with the decoupling of anti-colonialism and democracy. A decoupling which happened when most African nations became independent and undertook to set up political systems based on one-party modes of government, based on the containment of a number of aspirations, most of which had found a voice during the anti-colonial struggle. A process which someone like Frantz Fanon describes very vividly in a chapter of his book, The Wretched of the Earth, the title of which now escapes me, but it will come back. So we found ourselves in a position where we, in order to set up the Innovation Foundation for Democracy, we obviously have to try and reconnect with this tradition. But we need to reconnect with this tradition under entirely new conditions. I will say a few things about these entirely new conditions in a moment. But before that, I would like to specify that we are trying to reconnect with this tradition, on the one hand, by attempting to forge new social coalitions. I mentioned a moment ago intellectuals, artists, activists. I could go on and on and on. The idea is to bring into being new social forces. To bring them into being, taking into account the key major cleavages which characterize most of our societies today. Cleavages of class and inequalities, in the sense that part of what we are witnessing is, on the one hand, the acceleration of class consciousness among the beneficiaries of the post-colonial dispensation. The elites, most of whom have been able to detach themselves from their societies, most of whom are more accountable nowadays to external forces than to their own people. Most of whom have also been able, over the last 60 to 65 years, to use their position within the bureaucracy and state structures in order to undertake a process of private accumulation which is highly, tightly connected to the kind of extractivism which is so characteristic of our involvement with the world economy today. So cleavages, class cleavages, which are becoming more and more reinforced, which are indeed propelled by their capacity to capture, as we say in South Africa, the state, and to subject the state to these new processes of accumulation. But also gender cleavages, in the sense that, in fact, a gender war is going on as I speak in the African continent. It is not so much a silent war as a war of position. We can see it, we can hear the voices that are emerging out of this process, and we can see the ways in which they are coalescing and are trying to become a body. And part of the work of the foundation is to offer safe spaces for these voices to be expressed in their own terms and hopefully to be heard. So we have been doing a lot of work along those lines, trying to, for instance, develop a project around what we call in French le matrimoine. So you have a term in French called le patrimoine, which means the heritage that has been constituted by basically fathers and men, and then bequeathed onto their children. We are trying to do the same type of work on the heritage that has been constituted by women, put it together in a whole variety of forms in terms of systematic thinking, in terms of artistic reinvention, in terms of a fresque, in order to highlight what it is that has come from, let's say, that archive. But also generational cleavages, that just as a class war is going on, a gender war is unfolding, another kind of war is also going on, which opposes the elders to the youngsters. In societies where the rights of the elders are, let's say, likely to cripple the kind of generational justice without which our societies basically have no future. I pass over all the other forms of conflicts, religious, ethnic, regional, but these are the kinds of coalitions we are trying to put together, resulting from an analysis of where it is that we are today, with the goal of reopening the future in this continent. Reopening the future at a time when, globally, a new understanding of what it is to live on the same planet with other living beings is probably our highest priority. In any case, the priority for any new cultural or political agenda. The question of how to take care of the earth as, with capital E, the earth as a political category, the question of how to repair it, the earth, and above all, how to share it. The question of repair, the question of care, and the question of sharing being, in this case, the preconditions for the durability of the earth and the precondition for our own durability. Both forms of durability being, of course, entangled. It seems to us that this entanglement of all living beings and things is part of this new predicament, which might not have been there during the earlier periods I have alluded to, the period of struggles for against colonialism, struggles against apartheid. It seems to many of us as if this is one of the key questions which will haunt us during a huge part of this century. And we want to take it seriously as a starting point for any reinvention of democracy, as a key, let's say, prejudicial question in the process of let's say, thinking about what substantive democracy can possibly mean. And these questions of repair, of care, of sharing, of sustainability and durability can no longer be deferred. And what we are discovering is that, in fact, it is increasingly a matter of no less than developing an ecological intelligence to allow us to learn how to make space for life and how to live with, not against life. And this we are discovering throughout the effort to reconnect and reread and reinterpret African old cosmogonies. So, for instance, some of us have been, over the last 2 years and a half, reading again the Dogon cosmologies in Mali, or the cosmologies of the Bambara in Mali, in the Congo, and so forth and so on, in an attempt at finding out how in these systems of thought, most of which are available to us now through the long work of historians, anthropologists, through the careful reading of African objects, art objects, unfortunately most of which happen to be in Western museums, through a reopening and interrogation of that archive, it becomes possible to find out how it is that the question of le vivant has been dealt with, and how this preoccupation with life and life forms, life as such, can become part of a new critical reading of democratic forms. A kind of democracy which, of course, goes beyond elections, which goes beyond procedures, which implies deep institutional reforms, but which also builds on old traditions of representation, of association, of assemblage, in cultures which have for a very long time privileged relations over beings, relations over identity, cultures which have understood identity as the result of the qualitative relations one weaves not only with oneself, but also with the ancestors, with the community, with the cosmos, in the act of resonating with the cosmos, which is so central to their beliefs. So the question of the archive becomes therefore extremely important in this attempt at re-engineering the democratic ideal or the project of freedom, and this attempt at reopening the future, building a capacity for futurity. So it seems to me that in that sense, what the work we are doing in Africa is not that far away from part of what's being done elsewhere, because as we sense, two questions confront us today, and in fact will haunt us for most of this century. When I say us, as we were discussing yesterday, it's an us that is open-ended. It's an us that is objectively there, and yet It's an us that has to be built, to be assembled. We say in French, convoqué. C'est un nous qui doit être convoqué. It's an us that needs to be brought into being through various forms of struggles, through certain acts. So the two questions which confront us today and which will haunt us for most of this century are, first of all, the question of planetary habitability, of which I have said a few words a moment ago, and that of life futures, that of the future of reason and the future of freedom. And of course, we are called upon to grapple with these urgent issues, which are not at all abstract issues, at a time when we are hopefully coming to this realization that absent a significant adjustment to how we conduct our lives, parts of the earth will likely become inhospitable to life in the near future. And in any case, they will become inhospitable to life, not just in the near future. They are already inhospitable to life. And when you live in Africa, you see it. You see, for instance, in the whole region of the Sahel, which has been plagued over the last 50 years by recurrent droughts, you see how the ongoing conflicts, deadly conflicts, most of them are in fact triggered, at least in part, by the erosion, swift erosion of the ecological conditions. Ecological conditions for nomads, for instance, to keep alive their cattle, to be able to move seasonally from one region to another, to have access as they go along in their seasonal migration, have access to water, to benefit as it used to be in early pre-colonial dispensations, to be granted a set of rights, open-ended rights, which they could enjoy as they move from one place to the other. So we can see all of that. We can see the desert advancing. So it's not just a matter of distant future. It's already a matter of the present, of people, communities, and societies experiencing what life in the extreme is all about, and how it is that one builds conditions of resilience in the midst of instability and uncertainty. So when we say substantive democracy, what we mean is new forms of social order which can build precisely on the resources, the knowledge, the know-how communities have built over time in order to face these new conditions of volatility and uncertainty. And in so doing, it seems to many of us that we can then begin to have some sense of how we should inhabit anew and share as equitably as possible a planet whose life support system has been so severely damaged by human activities and which, of course, is in dire need of repair. We can also begin to see through these small acts, small gestures, how we should remember the planet. When I say remember the planet, of course I'm using the term in the sense of recalling it in the realm of memory. Because a lot of what it used to be has been lost. It has been, and this loss is irrecoverable. There are losses that can be attended to, but there are other losses that are irreparable. Question of irreparability. So I use remember in that sense, but also use remember in the sense of putting it back together, putting back together its different parts, reassembling it, reconstituting it, if you want, as an integrated system, a system in which all parts are interlinked in what I call a grand gesture of biosymbiosis and mutuality. And substantive democracy would be the name of that grand gesture of biosymbiosis and mutuality. And I use the term biosymbiosis deliberately to refer to the kind of originary equality and value of all forms of life. And mutuality, of course, as a key philosophical concept drawn from our own traditions, which we see, for instance, at work in the South African experiment, at least in the aftermath of apartheid. Why is it that I'm calling here upon the South African experiment? I'm calling upon the South African experiment in the aftermath of apartheid because here we have had, might not be the case today, but in that decade, we witnessed firsthand the attempt by a society to start all over anew. Recommencer is the French term. The attempt by a society that had undergone centuries of trauma, traumas of all kinds, racial trauma to begin with, to give itself a new opportunity to reorder itself by, first of all, reconciling for the first time, maybe in history, liberal democracy and the question of the racial. I believe that in modern history there have been three centers, three the term in French is foyer ardent, incandescent, you know this thing where the fire is made? Places where racism, modern racism, was forged. Of course, in the New World, in the Americas, the Caribbean, but also in Brazil, but also in South Africa. The racial question was not at all resolved by the kind of US form of liberal democracy. It's still not resolved. Had it been resolved, we wouldn't have what we see. It has not been resolved in Brazil neither. But there have been a conscious attempt in South Africa to deal with it. To deal with it theoretically and practically. In the South African case, theoretically, we are far ahead. Practically, we still have a long way to go. But at least there is a horizon. And a number of contemporary struggles in South Africa can be understood from within that horizon. And key to the resolving of the racial question in South Africa has been, of course, the understanding that during the years of apartheid, the destruction, or in any case, was predicated on the refusal of any debt, original debt, linking, let's say, the different parts of that community. But it's also predicated, this attempt at repairing, giving oneself the possibility of restarting, predicated upon some key values, beginning with the value of Ubuntu, which thinkers such as Pumla Madikizela have been writing about. And my friend Paul has been very interested precisely in the work of Pumla. So these questions of biosymbiosis, of sustainability, of durability, of, if you want, the interlacing of human history and Earth's history, these are far from abstract concerns. Then, so this is part of the new conditions we found ourselves in. Let me say one or two things about the question of life as such, since it is so central to the attempts at reimagining what substantive democracy could possibly mean or look like. As I was explaining yesterday during our lecture, we know that for a very long time, we have been concerned with how life emerges. There's a lot written on how life emerges, a lot written on its spatial distribution, a lot on the conditions of its evolution and resilience. We have been very preoccupied by such issues. We also know that today there is near agreement on a number of propositions related to this big question of life. The term life doesn't really say precisely what I have in mind, because in French, it's le vivant. What I'm talking about is le vivant. And le vivant is not, I think life is a bad translation of the term le vivant. So for those of you who are good in both languages, you might, whenever I say life, what I really have in mind is le vivant. And I'm saying that when it comes to debates around le vivant, there are a number of points of near agreement today. The first having to do with the fact that life has the ability to replicate itself while reducing the entropy at the expense of external sources. This is one thing we agree upon today. There is also agreement on the fact that, of course, the most abundant forms of life or life form that are present on Earth, or the most abundant, is microbial life. Of course, next to it, there are a number of other life forms, complex, carbon-based, but they only represent a small percentage of the total life of our planet. There is an agreement concerning the fact that le vivant is not passive, it is active. It has a capacity to shape itself and to shape the environments where it happens to emerge. So we have had that. But today, it seems to me that there's a shift going on. Shift is underway, and the key questions are no longer simply about the ways in which life emerges. We hear more and more questions concerning the ways in which life ends. I don't know about you here, but in the French-speaking world, over the last decades, that has been a huge part of our political discussions about life extinction, life coming to an end. The conditions under which this mega event happens. In the African context, interrogations concerning life end, in fact, have been there for a very, very long time. If we reopen the African archive, as I was referring to it a moment ago, we look into African pre-colonial systems of thought, we look into the metaphysics of what has been called animism, a terrible word, because you know, among anthropologists in the 19th century, animism was understood to be the set of beliefs people who had remained children holding. The idea was that, in fact, mature human beings at some point stop believing in things such as rocks having agency, ancestors speaking to one, either through dreams or other rituals. But people, primitive people, didn't. They kept believing in those myths. That's why the term animism is not the right one. But what it refers to the ways in which the question of life has been dealt with, how it has been redistributed, how, in fact, it is shared, how it circulates, and the conditions under which it can be nurtured and cared for and redeployed. So it seems to me that that archive today can be of importance for the task of reinventing democracy. In a context in which, of course, capital has become somewhat of a magnetic field, a situation which is made possible, of course, by the expansion of privatized government, the increasing patenting of species in the first half of the 21st century. All of that, I think, is very well known. So I wanted to share these intuitions with you. And I would like to end maybe with one or two considerations on exactly how we are trying to do this on the ground. We're trying to do this through the development of research projects, but a kind of open-ended research which is not exclusively the purview of academics, which is, in fact, a form of research in which communities themselves are embedded, are involved as key actors. We also try to do this through a whole series of training programs which have forced us to rethink what learning is all about. What learning is all about, I should say what co-learning is all about. The belief being that the subjects of learning, each subject of learning harbors one form or another of expertise. That expertise is redistributed, to use a term Sarah Nuttall uses, but referring to the university. And therefore, the bringing together of different forms of expertise in very specific settings is a way of opening up that possibility of turning learning into a form of curation. So, have been a lot of work from our teams on the ground on this idea of learning as a form of curation, which it always used to be in African pre-colonial systems of thought. Curation, first of all, of relations. That relations have to be nurtured. They have to be cared for. They have to be cultivated, because they come before ontology. Then we have been, and I'll end there, trying to remobilize the youth. Because most of the transformations, historical, that have happened in the continent have been spearheaded by the youth. Frantz Fanon died when he was 36. Lumumba was killed when he was 37. Mandela went to jail when he was in his 30s. Amilcar Cabral was killed in his late 30s. These are those who enacted some of the most significant transformations in our recent history. So we have to recapture that tradition, learn it, make sure that there is a transmission of memory so that the younger generations don't have to start all over again or act as if nothing ever happened before them. So we're doing a lot in that sense, in terms of memory transmission. And lastly, we are resorting systematically to the use of new technologies, most of which are technologies of calculation. And here the purpose is to find out whether these technologies of calculation can be turned into instruments of liberation. So if you want, I wanted to share with you these intuitions. I also wanted to tell you about these ongoing experimentations in which in the next 30 years will be both the oldest continent on Earth as well as the youngest. In this continent, which, this I will say in French because it's too late now to try to translate it in English, which is une réserve de puissance et une puissance en réserve, the two. And because it is both a réserve de puissance and a puissance en réserve, it has to carry its fair share of responsibility in relation to the fate of our world. So thank you very much for listening. I'll stop with that.
Hard to know how to respond, Achille, to that extraordinarily inspirational presentation. When Edward Said used to talk about the tetchy, difficult, complex, creative nature of late style, one slowly realized he was, without realizing it, talking about himself. So I want to say puissance en réserve and réserve en puissance. Here it is, right? So that was inspirational in the best sense. We had a conversation yesterday where you told me about the concept of the matrimoine, and I thought, wow, matrimony, how is that going to work in the new dispensation? And of course I didn't realize what you were doing was actually activating the concept as a counter-concept to patrimony and giving it new forms. I want to just ask a few questions about things you raised and see if maybe you might want to elaborate on them, but don't worry if you don't, we can then just go to questions. But when you talked about le matrimoine, I wanted to know whether you were talking about a female ethic, the struggle against sexual violence, the possibility of a de-idealized and therefore less hated form of mothering as it exists in Western culture. When you talked about generational cleavages, I found myself indeed thinking of the extraordinary work of Phumlakaboda Madikizela and a story I told the attendees at the summer school yesterday of the children she saw playing. You will know this example. Too young to have been alive at the time of necklacing, whose parents would not have talked about it, but who were staging the process of necklacing as part of their game, which raises the question of transgenerational haunting and of generational trauma going down through the ages as a form of repetition. When you were talking about caring and sharing, I found myself thinking of what David Harvey always describes so graphically, which is the immutable logic of capital, and the way that wealth accumulates and seems to, in that process of accumulation, generate a fear of being robbed, appropriately enough because it's illegitimate wealth in any case. How does the struggle against state capture and the corruption and appropriation of the new elites in South Africa avoid traps like that? I was very moved by what you were saying about le vivant. I wondered whether aliveness might be a translation of it. I was very struck, as I'm sure everybody was, by just the vivid picture you gave us of what your new Innovation Foundation for Democracy is in the process of doing and how you are activating that in the very structure of the forms of learning that you are trying to enter in. And I was very struck by the fact that Ubuntu is central to that, and relatedness and relationality. And I suppose I have a question about relatedness and relationality, which is how does it bypass the ills of human subjectivity? That is to say, the problem of how to relate. Something which I personally think psychoanalysis has never succeeded in articulating in a way that can make us feel safe, but that's not what it's trying to do. So every time all your examples, I thought this is so crucial, and where do we take it? Where next does it go? So you can respond to those questions or just leave them as comments and we can open it to the floor. It's entirely, this is your occasion, so we'll follow your path.
I think since you asked those questions, it means they need not to be responded to, but I would be happy to maybe make
a few comments. Yeah, that would be wonderful. And then we'll open it up to the floor. Okay.
Okay, now it's one of those terms, but maybe we'll rely on you to have translated in English, the matrimoine. It's clearly not matrimony. If I understand by matrimony, all that has to do with is it with marriage? Or, yeah, no, it's not about that.
I don't think so, no.
It is, in fact, it is a kind of archive, but really deep archive, which would contain, because it has to be brought into being, where one would find traces, testimonies, examples, archetypes of the ways in which feminine historical actors have enacted the political. We have been working with a number of feminist colleagues from North Africa, Morocco in particular, Morocco and Algeria, as well as in the rest of the continent, people from Senegal, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon and Ivory Coast. Likes of Fatou Sow, Yasmina Shami, is writing from Morocco, Soumaya Mesret from Tunisia, or Catherine Wajaku from Nigeria, who are doing both an ethnographic work, new cycle of ethnographic work on gender relations in the continent, and a historical rereading of a whole set of archives inherited from the recent past. And part of what they are finding is that historically, building on that historical material, it is possible to articulate a discourse on feminism today, of which might, not saying displace all that exists, but be a positive supplement, especially for those who are fighting for gender equality in the continent. So Le Matrimoine is the name that is given to that project of recovering female agency in practice, but also in the field of the production of ideas, and not memorializing all of that, but turning all of this into resources for new forms of thought and actual engagement in the struggles of the present. So it's an ongoing project which we are still busy defining, but it will give way to a new cycle of especially ethnographic work on the ongoing transformation of gender relations in the continent. The struggle against state capture, we have seen it in particular in South Africa. I told you about the first 10 years of democracy. 20 years later, they were followed indeed by a very difficult period, 10 wasted years during which, following Fanon's predictions, the former liberation movement basically turned into a predatory organ, preying upon the state and preying upon its own people. We were lucky in South Africa that civil society is pretty strong. The judiciary is strong. Media is, for the most part, free and, if not independent, in any case, extremely dynamic. Universities are still spaces for robust discussion and debates. Research is going on, and civil society organizations are very active. So the business sector too is very strong. So all these four independent forces came together in order to stop the bleeding, which resulted then in the dismissal of Zuma, and recently the falling of the ANC to 40% of the vote, where they used to have 60, 70%. So you stop state capture by unleashing the forces of civil society, which have to be built prior, of course, to all of this. And they have to be built via what I would call an intellectual rearmament. We are discovering in most parts of the continent that to sustain freedom, to reopen the future, we need to invest massively in intellectual labor. We need to rearm people intellectually and cultivate regularly their critical faculties. So we have put together a whole set of fora for this. We have, for instance, for people, students in summer schools, doctoral schools, mechanisms whereby that process is going on. But an intelligent civil society, intellectually armed civil society, is more likely to make sure that governments are made accountable. So your translation of Le Vivant is really good. Aliveness. Is it what you said? Yes, yeah, I find it very interesting. So look, these are brief comments on what you said. We could go on and on. I want to give space for.
Thing, which is your brilliant account of intellectual rearmament, and such atmospheres are more likely to generate a calling of governments to account. It's precisely why the humanities and the critical forms of thinking in universities are being assaulted at the moment in a way I've never seen so intensely in my life. So you've really defined a key aspect of the struggle. That was
it's absolutely key.
Yeah, thank you.
The key is to hold onto an expanded concept of reason. Because what we have been witnessing over a long period of time is an assault on not only on reason as such, but an impoverishment of the concept of reason and its reduction to instrumental rationality. The triumph, as André Leroy-Gourand, the French paleontologist, used to put it, the triumph of le geste over la parole, of means over ends. So we have this debate going on in South Africa where everything has to be relevant. And relevance has to do basically with the capacity to produce instrumentalities, which means the capacity to turn almost everything into that which can be bought and sold. And the reduction of reason to data. This is what the humanities are up against. And we have to create those spaces where this expanded concept of reason can flourish as that critical faculty which is hopefully universally shared, and on the basis of which we can make judgments which are moral judgments, and because they are moral judgments, they are able to distinguish between what is good and what is bad, and lead to some form or another of perfection in the very classical sense of the term.
Thank you so much. You're one of the few thinkers who would risk using the word perfection, but you have more than given it its place in your thinking for us to think about. Can I just check with our Amiel Melbourne people what time I know there's meant to be a drinks reception, and I suspect we were meant to stop at 7:30, but because we started a bit late, can we go to 7:45? Is that acceptable? Yes, Elia, our wonderful BIH manageress, has nodded. That means it's fine. Okay. All right, so can we have questions, please? Do you want me to point to the people?
Yes, sure, sure.
And shall we take couple of questions at a time?
Yeah.
Please. Oh, so was there another question in the front row? Okay. Okay, well, we'll have these two questions then, please.
Thank you, Professor, for that insightful lecture. So towards the end, you mentioned about having projects sort of that incorporate, indigenous perspectives or representative voices. For example, I'm doing a PhD project on life writing to foreground experientially informed perspectives to critique dominant narratives of development and human rights. And I particularly wanted to raise the issue of, like, say, for example, the tribals, the Adivasis in Kerala, for example. They were conducting a year-long hunger strike, which ended like just last month. And I find it really complicated to think about democratic institutions, some of the institutions, and state-sanctioned violence, when there is a counter movement that gets labeled as a Naxalite insurgency in the 60s, for example, when there was an attempt to facilitate equitable distribution of resources, or they get labeled as terrorists, right? And then, so for example, if there is a violent attack to facilitate equitable distribution of resources, that gets labeled as violence. It's emphasized. But where state-sanctioned violence becomes, not talked about or discussed or brushed under, and increasingly, I feel that when there is self-inflicted violence, for example, you're starving yourself, right? Then you get visibility, or you are collectively attacking a state institution, then you get visibility. So where armed resistance or a kind of violent resistance sort of seems like a necessity to be listened to. And so what are your thoughts on that?
Say what your question is. No, is that your question?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I stopped you in the middle. So your question was your last sentence?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Parvati. The gentleman. Sorry to have interrupted you in the middle.
Good evening. Thank you for your talk. I fear I'm going to be the ghost at the dinner. The challenge, I want to put a challenge to you, that the previous generation, people like Fanon, whatever, were very serious scholars. I look at your work, and you're not a serious scholar. If you look at how you describe slavery as a slave is a particular person, it's a complete contradiction to what Fanon. Everybody normally starts by saying a slave requires a master. You can't have a slave without a master. So when I look at your work, and even this evening, you can say the slave, you can go back to your work and you can follow it yourself. This evening you described the elite as the cause. This is a Marxist-related group. An elite is not a class. We have nomenclatura in the Soviet Union. That's an elite. It's not a class. In South Africa, the living standards, the share of wealth for the poor hasn't changed since 1991. And you're saying that the real problem is the elite. That's a delusion.
Could you say what your question
Yes,
is?
I'm coming to it. My challenge is that from the 70s, the quality of African scholarship has completely collapsed. And what we have is a black zizek, cheap, catering to fashion.
That is not
That's a challenge. I said it's a challenge.
I think you've done. Thank you.
I said it was a challenge. Somebody needs to challenge it.
Should we take another question, or do you want to respond?
I mean, what should I respond to?
There's another question there.
There are at least 10 questions. We'll come to you next.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting. So I'm going to sort of bring it in my own research area where I look at climate change and the racialized aspects of it. So Africans in Africa and in the diaspora, people of African descent, there's a provocation that we live as with a non-ontology, we're subhuman, non-human, we live a life of social death. So you talked about the ecological condition, which I would say climate change is a racist crisis because we're the least responsible, least able to respond to, and yeah. How will your substantive democracy respond to the fact that it's the root causes of racism, systemic racism, institutional, that put us in the condition that we're in? And how will it help us get out of this problem with the existentialism of climate change, the climate crisis?
Okay, we have the first question over here from Pavitri, if you want to respond to her question about violence and effectiveness and visibility, if I understood you correctly, and your question. So perhaps if you could respond to those, only if you want to, obviously.
Okay. Now I'll be a serious scholar. Since apparently many of us are not, and African scholarship has collapsed entirely, and I don't know, I mean, that's not what I witness on. I live in the continent. I travel a lot, and that's not what I see. So it's probably a question that is addressed to somebody else, not me. So I won't go into that. Now, the question of, look, the way in which these issues are dealt with, whether in South Africa, where I live, and what I'm talking about is what I see, or in the rest of the continent, where I've spent a lot of time, is that there is a very deep demand for radical transformation. I mean, wherever you go, people are yearning to see to it that the current state of things is overhauled. For the last few years, the big discussions which are going on in the African academy, in the African civil society, in the African digital sphere, on radio, television, newspapers. The big discussion is, how do we enact radical transformation? Can we do it through elections, for instance? Or do we need to do it through violent means? What forms of violence? These are the discussions that are going on, which you hear also in a lot of the artistic production, which is going on through slammers, music, painting, and so forth and so on. So you have those who believe that so-called democracy, or in fact multi-party politics, because it's not democracy, multi-party politics, the ways in which it has been implemented since the 90s, has not led to any serious transformation. In most instances, it has been neutralized once again by the elites who form a social class, who know exactly what their interests are, economic and otherwise, and who know how to defend those interests, who have the means to do so, especially using violence, and who benefit from their connections with international capital and finance. You have those who argue that where free and fair elections have happened, they might have led to a change of those in power, but not to the kind of generational change which would have allowed for a proper redistribution of resources, for instance, in a context in which many are struggling for survival. You go to Lagos, you go to Kinshasa, Luanda, Abidjan, or Douala, most of the people, the inhabitants, nobody knows exactly how many they are. Nobody can tell you, as I speak, how many people live in a city like Lagos. We just know that there are many. And the majority of them survive through their participation in informal networks, so-called informal economy. That's the fact. So, a number of young people in particular have been involved in a number of violent movements, either as child soldiers or in any case markets of violence, which are emerging in a number of places. Go to Eastern Congo right now. That's what's going on. And it's connected to the extraction of key minerals, most of which are absolutely critical for the functioning of the so-called dematerialized economy we live on in the rest of the world. That's what is going on. You go to Sudan, exactly the same thing. You go to the Sahel, the same thing. And yet, there's a different proposition, which is that, in fact, radical transformation can happen through other means, most of which are which we have to identify. We have to do a cartography of these innovations. We have to connect them to each other in a continental network so that people fighting in Kaduna can connect to people fighting in Lubumbashi. And today it's possible to create those connections and to bring such a movement to exist. Last week I was in Cape Verde. We assembled in Cape Verde 160 people coming from organizations and communities we have been working with over the last year, some of which we have been funding. Not big funding, 5,000 euros here, and you have a mobile library attending to the needs for young people, because there's no democracy, not access to books. That's the predicament. So I'm not talking about, theory. I'm talking about things I have witnessed, I've been involved in, not alone, but with others. I'm not sitting in London pontificating about the state of African Academy without knowing what it is exactly. I've been teaching in South Africa in a university for the last 23 years. I know what it is. So don't come here and teach me about I don't know what. I'll calm down now, but I've given you back what you gave me. Okay? So those are the debates that are going on. And what we are trying to do is, as I was arguing early on, to try to reopen a future, building on the best of the traditions we have inherited. And there are some that are there. We have to excavate them, revisit the archive, and relaunch this long walk to freedom, as Mandela put it. There have been transformations everywhere. You go to Johannesburg today, South Africa, it's true that the inequalities are still extremely high. Most of them, they are racialized, but it's not true that nothing has happened. It's absolutely not true. things are changing. They are changing with difficulty. The cost is borne mostly by the poor in general. And I mean, have to position ourselves in relation to all of that. Or if we can't, then maybe it's better to just leave and go and live somewhere else. But as we know, going and living somewhere else as a black person on this earth is not at all mean. So we have to make sure that we change our own continent and we make it a living, habitable space, not only for Africans, but for anyone who wants to live there. That's, in any case, what I believe.
I think you embody the relationship between thought and enactment in an absolutely unique and effective way, and we're very lucky to have you here. We have a question from the third row from the front here. You've already asked your question, I'm afraid we can't come back to it. And then let me just see, can you put your hands right up so I can see how many more questions there are? Okay, we'll then go to the person at the back. I'm just going to pick up, and then here. Okay, so we're going to go to the gentleman with his hand up. No, it's not a gentleman, it's a, sorry, never mind, it's irrelevant what it is. The person with the glasses with their hand up, and then the person at the end of the row, about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 rows up there. Can we take those? So can we take those, those 3 questions, please?
Well, in the interest of time, I'll just keep it short. Thank you very much, Professor. It's been very insightful, and I've added a lot of books to my reading list. I just wanted to get more of an idea of the notion that you were describing about bringing together different expertise as a form of curation, because I think that could be very beneficial for our times. So I just wanted to hear you expand on that.
Okay.
Can I project, or do I need a microphone? I get so nervous.
Okay, and then when you've asked your question, it's going to go to the end of your row here. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. It's very exciting. I haven't seen you this fired up since a student told you that you missed.
I was fired up when we were talking about decolonization during the years of these debates on decolonization in South Africa, you remember?
I know.
Yeah.
I told you you didn't understand Canon. It was very exciting.
I think you do need the mic, actually.
Oh, no, okay.
Could you pass it along, please?
So my question is about debt. So if we are thinking about this new substantive democracy, and I think you do emphasize kind of the importance of thinking it from the continent, and also I think very interesting is you've emphasized not so much tonight, but in your writing and in other speaking, this emphasis on a moral imagination, not just a political imagination, which I find interesting because, at least in the stuff I read, that's not something that people talk about a lot, the emphasis on the moral as distinct from the political. So if we are thinking about questions of substantive democracy from Africa, a word that comes to mind is that of debt. So whether it is a financial debt, as we're seeing now play out in the Kenyan streets, in terms of the IMF and the World Bank, or kind of moral debt, like white South Africans post-apartheid, or even like a planetary debt that's shared by us all. How do we think about that debt in terms of building, or I guess my question is, what role does debt have in this new substantive democracy?
Thank you so much. If you could pass the mic to the end of the row, and then we'll give you a chance to respond.
Thank you, Professor Mbembe. I must say that I have benefited so much from you as a Black African scholar. So keep on, because there's nothing new under the sun. My question is brief as a young person. On the question of the younger generation, how then do we work around memory transmission through intellectual labor in institutions of higher learning? So the execution of memory transmission in institutions of higher learning.
Okay. Please respond. I think this will probably be the last response for now.
So the first question was about...
The first question, do you want to...
It was about
I just wanted you to expand on bringing different expertise together.
Different expertise, yeah.
Sorry.
The starting point of our work on pedagogy, ways of teaching, methods of teaching, starts from the observation that, in fact, where I teach in Johannesburg in South Africa, many young people, students in my seminars when I used to hold them regularly, didn't really want to be lectured. You can't come here and then you start lecturing. They wanted to be active parts of what was going on in the classroom. Not just that they wanted to be heard, but they wanted to actively participate in the production and sharing of what they knew prior to engaging with a text. And they knew it either through their personal experience or through other forms of inquiries they had been engaged in on the phone, different forms of encounters. They wanted to turn the classroom into a democratic space based on some form or the other of equality, including equality, epistemic equality, if you want to put it like that. And these demand to not be lectured at, but to be part of this moment when we produce different forms of knowledge based on where we come from, who we are, what we know. This demand was very powerful. And it forced some of us to interrogate the kind of vertical, hierarchical relationship which characterizes a number of pedagogical settings, including in our universities. And it led us to try to imagine other forms, indeed, of learning together or learning in common. And when I talk about different forms of expertises, that's part of what I'm talking about. And this was even more so, more manifest, when within the foundation, we began to bring together researchers, activists, artists, and so forth and so on. So I can tell you about a number of situations where colleagues of mine, researchers, came in and spoke as if they were amongst themselves. So they used this language, quotations, all the lingo, which is so typical of the ways in which we valorize ourselves, we are recognized, and we climb up the hierarchy. Of course, they were not talking with others. So I'm referring to that tension. How is it that we make that space more democratic? How we valorize different forms of knowledge, different languages, ways of speaking, modalities of addressing each other. That's what I had in mind, and it comes from that experience. Now, in terms of memory, Karabo, you see, I really believe there is a big difference between, let me put it differently, historically, our societies in the longue durée have invented forms of memory production, memory keeping, memory transmission, most of which were not written. Unless we understand, we expand the concept of writing in order to include in it the production of meanings in general. A production of meaning which operates through either artistic forms, then you have a sculpture, a Benin sculpture, for instance, or a mask, a Pahuin mask, unless we understand it as a form of archiving and writing. And indeed, it can. We can expand the concept of writing. We can also expand the concept of the library, if we understand by the library that space where the knowledge accumulated over years and time is housed, so that I wasn't born in 1854, but if I want to know what has been produced from 1854 up to now, I can go to the library, I can work into the archive, and I can have some knowledge of that. What is it that was invented? What is available? In order to properly define what is needed, so that I don't invent what has already been invented. So I'm giving a leg up. I don't have to waste time reinventing what already exists. What is actually happening for those of us who work with social movements, especially young people's organizations, whether in South Africa or in Senegal, Ivory Coast, or Cape Verde? Part of what we observe is that, for instance, they want to get involved in the political struggle for transformation. But their knowledge of, or let's say their experience, they begin that nothing happened before them. That is all starting now. And yet that is not true, that everything is starting now. It's absolutely fundamental, for instance, in the work we are doing on substantive democracy, to be aware of what someone like Amilcar Cabral said about it, how he enacted it in the context of the struggle against Portuguese colonialism in the liberated zones of Guinea-Bissau. It is important to have some knowledge of the ways in which Julius Nyerere and his Ujamaa project tried to attend to the ways in which political order can take care of people's basic needs. It's important to inherit all of that. It's important that we build institutions that allow for the transmission of that memory. So this question is absolutely critical. So we have to attend to that. Now, as far as the concept of debt is concerned, Jessica, at least for me, there are two forms of debt. There is a form of, I would call it expropriatory debt, a debt that diminishes the one who is indebted, a debt, the function of which is to extract from the person who is indebted as much resources as possible. And when I say resources in the large definition of resources, dignity being one of them. So, for instance, in the early years of independence, African countries accumulated a huge amount of debt in order to fund higher education, healthcare, to attend to the basic social needs. Colonialism. They were so indebted that in the mid-80s, they were forced to reimburse those debts, and they were unable to do so. So international financial institutions, beginning with the IMF and the World Bank, imposed upon them structural adjustment programs, the aim of which was to deregulate the economy, make sure that they had enough resources to pay back the debt, which led to what many have qualified as a form of recolonization. So you have that kind of debt, a form of debt which enhances the forms of subjugation. But there is also another form of debt, which is, if you want, constitutive of any relation. In the sense that, you see, I mean, none of us has asked to be born, to be born. I wasn't somewhere and then I asked my father and my mother, now, can you bring me to life? No. I wasn't there. And yet I owe them a debt of life. I wouldn't be here today if I was not the beneficiary of that debt, that constitutive debt, which is predicated upon a set of relations, whether we want them or not, which precede our own existence, and of which we are accountable. That radical accountability, it begins there. Of course, I can say I have nothing to do with my parents, but that does not eliminate, in and of itself, the fact that I owe my life to them, and it's a kind of debt that is irremboursable, unpayable if you want, because it is priceless. It is beyond any attempt at quantification. It is incalculable in the exact measure of its the impossibility of reimbursing it. So as I was arguing yesterday with some of the students, so this element of incalculability is clearly should be the starting point of any reflection on, first of all, debt, and on the types of relations it might be possible to think of if we want to re-engineer national and planetary forms of democracy. So, I'm not answering your question directly, but I'm sharing with you the ways in which we can begin to frame the issues or the questions. And it seems to me that in the situation we find ourselves now, answers are less important than the process by which we try to frame questions in a proactive manner. And that's what my own work has been all about. And I don't need any excuse for having chosen that path. So you see, I'm a bit combative tonight. So maybe it's time to go and have a drink. me a supper.
Yeah, we definitely owe you a supper.